Your chair at present is equally uniquely underqualified, and I am here to learn so much from him. As someone who's taken an interest in sub-regional and regional groupings such as BCIM and BIMSTEC and GMS and Mekong India and Mekong Ganga and all these things, one thing that strikes me is how fragmentary and divided all the discourse is. So you have people who write on connectivity and trade facilitation, and they talk one sort of discourse, and at the end they come to a few obstacles, which are all about real life and real politics. And their complaint, of course, is the slow pace of progress in India-China in Indian-operated projects within Myanmar. These people are often trumped by the so-called security discourse in reference to insurgent groups on both sides of the border. There's another geopolitical discourse, which of course is seeing Myanmar as primarily a state of confrontation of Indian and Chinese interests and geopolitical ambitions in the region. And this provokes quite extreme knee-jerk reactions, short-term thinking, wooing, stalling, sometimes idealism, sometimes pragmatism, and so on. So talk of soft borders, talk of hard borders, and so on. So in all of this, one feels that all discussion is fragmented. People are not talking to each other, or they put things in other black boxes and don't share them. Isolated from a wider frame of regional and global politics, or just another episode in China's great game in Asia, or a strategy to contain India, or whatever, or a strategy for world domination. What I think we need, and what I'm sure will emerge today, is a wider picture of the internal and external dynamics of Myanmar and our relations with Myanmar, and the process of democratization. And in some ways, I'd almost like to give the problematic, after talking about the oppositions, the name of governance, which I think covers what is wrong in our northeast region and across the border in Myanmar as well. I think we should sometimes get rid of the more loaded terms and think in different categories. So with great enthusiasm, we welcome you here, back to Delhi, back to this room, and look forward to many more interactions. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Patricia. It's a great honor to be here, back, as you said, after several years. I've been to Stockholm actually for a very extended period of time, first in 1968, so it's quite some time. But you're framing the overall discussion in the terms you have actually brought me to the title itself, which doesn't mention India.
Yes.
Obviously, we are going to discuss India also, but I thought I'll try to present to you more the UN perspective, at least to some extent, given my last position in the UN as Special Advisor on Myanmar. Let me start, of course, by expressing my sadness at the air crash. It recently took a lot of deaths among particularly the army, and it's caused a lot of heartbreaks inside the country. They're still actually trying to cope with it. My own exposure to Myanmar has been strictly in the multilateral sense. I have not really served in Myanmar as part of the Indian Foreign Service. Very little. I know that there are a large number of experts on Myanmar from the bilateral context, and I therefore hesitate to really bring up my own views. But let me broadly frame it in the context of how the UN has been involved in the process of democratic change over the last fact over the last 20 years, but really over the last 7, 8 years, with the essential problems of democratization, including the very internationally visible problem of Rakhine, and then get to the peace process, basically, and what the peace process has, how it has evolved so far in the last few years, how the UN has been involved, however minimally, and what the implications are with regard to the role which is being played by China. The involvement of the United Nations in Myanmar began actually, obviously, after the brutal clampdown, after the army refused to accept the results of the elections in May 1990. And it consisted over the years, over 2 decades and more, of annual naming and shaming resolutions in the General Assembly since 1991 that condemned the military action of the government, that called for the replacement of the civil government, expressed concern at the human rights situation, called for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and others, and the protection of ethnic minorities. The situation did not come very much on the agenda of the Security Council, though it is technically on the agenda of the Security Council. But every time routine attempts were made by even P5 members, they were actually shot down by, basically with the assistance of China. Despite this, however, the General Assembly and the Security Council did provide fairly strong support for what they call the good officer's role of the United Nations Secretary General through his senior advisor. Even that actually initially was mostly pro forma and infructuous. One special advisor called it his visits to Myanmar like visits to the gym, to the dentist, unpleasant but necessary. Over the years, of course, the military policies of the regime, of course, drew an array of sanctions, economic boycotts, and trade embargoes against Myanmar. And for 2 decades, Myanmar was denied any support for official development programs, no technical assistance, no capacity building. ODA was reduced to $6 per capita, among the lowest in the NDC world. Although the UNDP had an office, it was actually specifically prohibited by countries like the United States from having anything to do in terms of official capacity building with the government itself. It was only in May 2008 when Cyclone Nargis happened, it was that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon undertook 2 visits to Myanmar at that critical juncture, that led to the setting up of a tripartite core group coordination mechanism to handle the humanitarian implications of the disaster with the ASEAN. And that facilitated a large-scale humanitarian response. In fact, at one stage, the French were talking of responsibility to protect. In fact, humanitarian intervention there, luckily that was not followed with any degree of seriousness. But the Cyclone Nargis provided the possibility of moving from the naming and shaming aspect to trying to work with the military government in order to look at how the UN and Myanmar could work in a constructive format. Of course, the regime had announced its 7-point roadmap, and immediately after the Cyclone Nargis was the 2008 referendum, which, even though the legitimacy of the referendum was questioned, and the general elections that followed was also described by the UN as deeply flawed. Nevertheless, I think it provided the opportunity for the UN good officers to move forward, to evolve significantly into cautious but positive reinforcement, engagement and support for the reform process. I recall my first meeting in November 2010 with Aung San Suu Kyi, who had actually opposed the constitution of 2008 and opposed the election then. And in my first meeting, she declared that a parody of democracy is infinitely worse than an outright dictatorship. And that was, at that time, it almost indicated that she was going to frontally oppose the entire process of civilization. In a sense, she called it ersatz civilization. But in my response to her, I admitted that perhaps the parody of democracy, a parody of democracy is worse than a dictatorship, but what we may be seeing now may not exactly be entirely a parody, and that the reason, even though we called it deeply flawed, we sort of said that there was more to be gained by working with the government. The reason I mentioned this was there were a large number of NGO communities which had met me before I had met her. Small groups, including Egress, Myanmar, Egress and others, who said that if she were to frontally oppose the government, there's nothing they could do. They would have to fall entirely along with her, and then the whole possibility, the space, the very limited space they had built would actually close. So they said, please tell her. I said, why don't you go and tell her? They said, it's not possible for us to do so. It is a credit to her wider sort of perspective that when I mentioned this, she said, I've just come out of detention and we need to meet with various people. And within a few months, of course, she had a meeting with then President Thein Sein, and she decided actually to move in the direction of working as an opposition, and she participated in the by-election, and as they say, the rest is history. To some extent, I think that was a game changer. President Thein Sein himself, of course, I think in moving to consolidate the transition, did play a fairly important role and in promoting the democratic process, including the activities of an opposition. And in that sense, I think he set up institutions. He, in fact, helped to consolidate the institutions of parliament, as well as in many ways the structures of government, including that of the election commission. And I think, despite the fact that many people around were inclined to be very critical of the process of civilization and the fact that the army still controlled, they had some basic controls in place under the 2008 constitution, they were not, I think what he did help to move the process towards a fledgling kind of what he called disciplined democratic situation. Though in some ways his government was also in a sense, they were largely, the decision making was largely confined to his office. There was improved coordination and cohesion. There was a much greater preparedness to reflect the best practices from the outside world, and I think a willingness to listen to some of the suggestions coming from the outside world. And I think in that sense, the Thein Sein government did show a much greater degree of willingness to listen to ideas, institutional as well as in terms of governance ideas from the outside world. Of course, the 8th November last year, the 8th November 2015 elections gave the National League for Democracy a landslide victory, and then you found what may have been what can be called a truly democratically elected government. But despite its commanding lead of almost 80% of the elected seats, it was still it had still to work within the constitutional limitations, which had 25% representation in parliament by the army, and of course the control of very many, 3 or 4 critical ministries by the army, and of course the Security Council of the National Security Committee was still under the firm control of the army. While the army publicly announced its commitment to respect the popular will and allow civilian government to function, it is clear that they're determined to keep control as long as the commitment to the three, what they call the 3 national causes, non-disintegration of the union, non-disintegration of national solidarity, and perpetuation of sovereignty, as well as clear that as long as the peace process, the problems with the ethnic armed groups continued, and the process of the ceasefires as well as the political dialogue had not reached a stage of, in a sense, what they would see irreversibility towards along the lines of a union. They were not prepared to give up power, and this, I think, continues to be the situation now. Meanwhile, of course, the UN has been supporting and assisting Myanmar in critical areas like governance and rule of law, socio-economic development, anti-corruption, police reform, judicial practice, and of course several areas of humanitarian assistance and human rights capacity building. Obviously, the requests by the United Nations for a human rights presence, a full mandate human rights presence, was successively, of course, opposed by the government itself. Now, one of the major challenges that the government faced almost immediately after the last government of Thein Sein came into power, and which in a sense threatened to undermine the reform process, was of course the communal violence in Rakhine. And publicly, if you see in the United Nations particularly, and in the international community, there's less of discussion on the peace process and much more on Rakhine. So in a sense, in terms of the public perception, the democratization process, the test of democratization in Myanmar is not so much how they're able to proceed in proceeding in the political dialogue with the ethnic armed groups, but more on how that gets expressed in terms of the ending of institutional discrimination in Myanmar, particularly in light of the condition, the situation in northern Rakhine after the 2012 disturbances. In fact, the communal violence in 2012 actually made even handling the communal situation there a priority area for the engagement of the United Nations. And I was one of the first foreigners to visit the state of Rakhine after the outbreak of violence. Successively, we have been trying to meet with the leaders, both at the state level, at the central level, to call for reasoned discourse, interfaith cooperation, countering hate speech. At the ground level, the United Nations was very well aware of the complexities of the issue of citizenship and status inside the country. Clearly, despite the fact that internationally, the state, even the word Rohingya is seen to be something which is part of self-identity of any minority groups, etc. But when you use the word inside the country, it does have, there is a history, and even people who have studied the history know that it's not so self-evident, the logic of the rationale of using the word Rohingya. And in fact, even the British till the 90s didn't use the word Rohingya, and so there is a complex kind of disputation and a controversy regarding the validity, the legal validity, the political validity of using the word, the name itself. But the fact of discrimination, institutionalized discrimination, the need to provide them greater dignity, the fact that many of those who call themselves Rohingyas had actually citizenship rights, had actually been given citizenship, and after 62 some of it was taken back, they were reissued white cards and things like that. There were difficulties relating to the establishment of their political and citizenship rights in the past, and that problem got aggravated through the, in a sense you could say, through the progress or the progression of populist politics with democratization. So the very nature of the democratization process, in fact, released some of the worst stereotypes in majoritarianism, among the majoritarian community, and brought about a great degree of hiatus between the communities in Rakhine. throughout the last few years, the UN has been trying to push, very aware, of course, that this was one of the poorest areas in Myanmar, and development had to reach all communities. It was not as if the discrimination against in some ways, actually, the Muslim community in Rakhine was receiving more international assistance than even the Buddhist community was receiving. In fact, the UNHCR had a presence there over decades. And that fact of even during the army regime, the HCR's presence there brought about a very peculiar dynamic even with regard to the popular attitude towards the United Nations. The United Nations was seen as helping only one community, the Muslims, and therefore the attitude of the majority community towards the UN was that it favors the Muslims there. And that was difficult over the years, even after the changeover, for the United Nations to, in a sense, overcome. And we had, on the other hand, internationally, the UN was under pressure to do more. So we were, in a sense, faced with a very peculiar kind of a pressure on both sides. If we were to work with the government, we had to be seen as being amenable to both communities. And whenever we came back from our missions, we were told, what has the UN actually done? So there was a major pressure which the United Nations was facing, and this was to an extent aggravated by the growth of social media and other sort of modern methods of media penetration, which actually resulted in a lot of fabricated news, which is being brought out, and which resulted in a very kind of a huge build-up of popular pressure from the international community among the NGOs on the UN to do more and more. That is now, within the UN, it also created a bit of a problem, because some of the segments within the United Nations which were trying to work for political dialogue, etc., found themselves, in a sense, at a disadvantage, because we were asked to push at every meeting the human rights agenda, and that prevented us from being able to even get access in many respects. And the same continued even after the Thein Sein government with the lady, because the lady also had her overall position, despite the fact that she did in her meetings internationally, particularly the United Nations, talk about respecting the rights of all communities, etc. Her basic position was not very different from the majority community's public position. And she did talk about the fact that though Buddhists were in a majority in Myanmar, in the larger region, the shift had taken place perhaps over the generations, and the Buddhists, he said, in that region felt themselves at a disadvantage, and she did seriously believe that. So how this would move in terms of being able to address both the problems inside the country, because when we met with even the previous government, despite successive pressures, attempts to ask them to move in the direction of providing more, a slightly greater degree of public equality, end of discrimination, etc. In fact, what was being done was the opposite. Before religious laws came in, the disenfranchisement of many communities, including the Buddhists, in the aftermath of the census, all of which, in a sense, brought them more and more towards the situation of being a beleaguered community, and that had also resulted in a radicalization which we saw in October last year, when the nature of the violence changed, and you had a situation where a group called the Harakat al-Yaqeen or Amal Mujahideen, began to work began a kind of operation which was self-consciously with some help from outside, but which was self-consciously towards a violent remedying the situation. And that also, in a sense, brought very strong repercussions through the security forces, which resulted in large-scale migration movements across the frontier towards Bangladesh. And today, the human rights, particularly in Geneva, the United Nations is now pressing for investigation of crimes against humanity and things like that, which I think has brought the UN on a kind of a confrontation course with the local government. All this, even during this period, it's interesting that it is the Western countries which were putting the major pressure on even on Dao Su and others to resolve the major problems of in Rakhine, particularly of the Rohingyas and the local communities. The Chinese were very quiet, and on many occasions I have been in my meetings in Beijing as well as in New York. I have been asking the Chinese whether they would be willing to take a slightly more proactive role in addressing some of the issues, considering the fact that they had many equities there. They were, since 2009, 2010 particularly, they had already signed major agreements on port development, on the oil pipeline and the gas pipeline, of course, and then the 4.2 billion assistance for infrastructure, etc. So there were large equities which the Chinese had in that region, and when we suggested to them that necessitated their looking at a role which could provide a greater degree of participation, improvement in the livelihoods of all communities, their response was, yes, but let's go at it quietly, let's go slowly. There's been only one instance, I think, where Sun Guoxiang has publicly mentioned that he had taken up this issue, and I think the Myanmar response was, please keep out of it. And I think that has given the Chinese a clear message that they're not going to take much, they don't intend taking the Rakhine issue, keep that on top of their agenda. I think some of the problems relating to the irregular migrants has become a regional problem. Movements to Malaysia, movements to Thailand, all these issues are being handled by Myanmar both in bilateral terms with other ASEAN members, bilaterally with Bangladesh, but I think they've been very, very averse to accepting any locus standi for the international community to discuss these, and they've taken publicly, in fact, any attempt by them to move in the direction of accepting an improvement of the citizenship, or a serious examination of the citizenship what they call the Bengalis, has faced the opposition of the Rakhine majority. In fact, as soon as she came into, within months of her coming into office, partly at the instance of the United Nations, in a sense, she'd mentioned that she would keep this as an important priority, and the appointment of the Kofi Annan committee, which was basically an internal national committee, with the president, as she was going along to set up this committee, I think it was partly some of the advice given by outsiders that unless there was some credible presence, international presence, it would not be the work of this committee would not really receive credibility. And I think she recognized that, and it was possible for us to pursue it. In fact, I recall that Kofi himself had a long conversation with the Secretary General and with myself before accepting it. And we did mention to him that though this would be a poison chalice for him, it would be useful internationally if he were to commit himself to this. And I think it is, in some ways, I think if there is to be any progress further on the issue of Rakhine, I think it is the Kofi Annan report which will probably be the way in which it would move forward. Of course, an interim report has come in. The full report will probably come in another few months. And it is possible that it may be considered even, the government may be amenable to it being considered at the United Nations in some way. And, if there is support for this national committee, I think that could set some kind of a direction towards a slow, progressive movement to work some of the crux issues, long-term issues of both of citizenship, of dignity and humanitarian for the amelioration of the humanitarian situation, as well as the larger livelihood issues pertaining to both communities. And it's interesting that one of the suggestions in the interim report also pertains to the question of how the major presence of parties like China in the Chokfu and other projects, what the effect of the special economic zone, how it will affect local communities, what kind of strategic economic assessment should be made regarding the environmental and social impact of these, what kind of public participation there should be in terms of building further on the economic possibilities in that area, and the need for greater coordination between all the, this is being discussed increasingly inside the communities now, and that as a consequence of this possibility, there are some other international organizations which are also now trying to see if this will be a way in which you can both bring out a better harmony between the communities, build up livelihoods, and resolve the major problems of citizenship and status for the Rohingya community itself. Now, I think it's important for me to move to I've not talked about the latest, the radicalization after the October events and what that will mean, but basically I think it's the impact of the army's operations in terms of the public image of whether or not the regime will be accused of crimes against humanity, etc. As far as I can see now, while the UN has actually committed itself and has appointed a 3-member committee to make an investigation, it's increasingly clear that many of the major countries of Europe, as well as the United States, are not going to push it that far. They probably keep giving support for it. The Myanmar government is frankly opposed to giving them any kind of even cooperation. I think this will become just a pressure point, but I don't know whether this is going to go very far. And as I said, it's probably the Kofi Annan track which will probably be the track in which any reasonable progress can be made. The only impact of this is the impact it will have in terms of the UN's presence there. There's been criticism even yesterday of the removal of the projected removal of the head of the UN Resident Coordinator's office there. The UN has been thinking in terms of upgrading its presence there, but I don't know whether the government is willing to even accept that kind of a presence. Meanwhile, of course, last year, with the winding down of the mandate of the special advisor, the major impact of that has been that the presence of the special advisor's office and his local presence is actually now is no longer there. There is no local presence of the special advisor inside the country, and the impact of that in the peace process is going to be really affected. Now let me come to the point of the peace process, which is it's in fact over 7 decades now the conflict between the army and the ethnic groups has waxed and waned, and I think it's clear by and large to everybody that the conflict cannot be resolved militarily. Despite this, of course, there is still a lot of mistrust and feeling among some of the major ethnic groups that unless there is a continuous thrust and without conceding the impossibility of any continuation of conflict, I think their ability to get a better deal in terms of the peace process will be affected. And that's increasingly, you see, it's not just the leaders of the armed groups, but even among the popular communities in Kachin and others, you're seeing a greater radicalization. I've seen this myself over the last few months, particularly in my last few visits in Kachin. But the fact that the army has actually, the civil rule, the Thein Sein government offered is discussions on a ceasefire, the discussions which are quite different from earlier discussions. There have been from time to time over the last several decades moves by the Tabadaw to have ceasefires, but these ceasefires were more in the nature of deals between leaders on both sides to, in a sense, share the spoils, as it were, and rent-seeking opportunities on both sides. It was not really, there was no commitment at any stage to a political dialogue. I think it was in 2012 when Thein Sein called for a discussion on a nationwide ceasefire to be followed by a political dialogue, that a major change in the approach to the peace process with the ethnic armed groups really happened. It is true that there were a large number of even the ceasefire with the BA was actually signed in '89, but the fact is most of these were supposed to be followed by border, sort of some border guard forces, etc. But there was no discussion of how the political process would move forward. And in a way, immediately after the president offered to discuss mainly with the Karens, and some ceasefire talks took place. In the north, the problems and tensions with the Kachin actually got aggravated and worsened. And it was basically after a very heavy exchanges between the army and the Kachin forces, including use of helicopters, and on 2 occasions, I think the attacks, some of the I think it went across the border areas and affected the Chinese. That the Chinese became fairly concerned and quickly got the Kachins as well as the army together in Delhi and had 2 rounds of discussions for ceasefire. This was in 2010, I think. Yes, 20 2010, isn't it? No, 20, yeah. At that time, I recall on both occasions when Wang Min, who was leading the delegation and who was actually the chief negotiator of the ceasefire with the Karenza and the others, I met him almost immediately on his return from Roili. And on both occasions, he did unease at the fact that the government as well as the ethnic armed groups had to discuss the ceasefire not in Myanmar territory but outside in Chinese territory. Some months before that, Wang Min himself had actually approached the UN to see whether the UN could help in being present at the ceasefire talks itself. He had suggested that he would want to have international presence. Not only to the UN, but he also asked bilaterally asked some others, including some NGOs. And it was interesting that initially our response, the response of the UN was not one of great alacrity, and we were still considering it when the donor support group was formed, and some NGOs, including the, I think CDH also were present. But after the Roili meetings, the Kachin spoke of the need to have international presence, and they mentioned the US, UN, UK, and China. The Chinese were naturally not amenable to a very large international presence, and while the government was able to work out an agreement with the Kachins and some of the other groups who eventually joined to have the next round of peace talks, the third round of the talks for a ceasefire in Myitkyina. They were not, I think the government also was a little wary about pushing for the presence of too many outsiders, and eventually they were able to work with the Chinese to have the presence of the UN and China as neutral third-party observers. And it was left to me to in a sense, discuss it with the UN and the UK and others, and tell them that this would probably be the best via media. The United States was amenable to that, as was the United Kingdom eventually, so long as they were kept in the picture, and we kept most of the time we did brief them on most of the discussions and our own participation. On their part, the Chinese, while initially a little allergic to any outside presence, eventually found that if they were not to be present as a protest for other international presence, they themselves may be out. And in fact, I recall that at the first meeting they were not present. They came almost 25 minutes, half an hour late, but they eventually did come and eventually accepted the presence of the UN. In many ways, I think the presence of the UN was accepted by Wang Min and the Thein government as a balancing factor, because they felt that the Chinese were needed in order to be able to put pressure on some of these northern groups, but at the same time they were afraid that that presence could be leveraged in a manner which could prove to be a little difficult for the army itself to handle, and therefore the negotiators were able to accept this kind of a presence. And in about 8 meetings after that, for almost 3 years, we were able to meet successively in Myitkyina and other places, and I think the Chinese and the United Nations teams were present at all the meetings. And it was basically, it was not as if we were there for substantive negotiations, but we were able to be on the sidelines, be present when there were major breakdowns, as it were. We were able to quietly move with each party, not necessarily serving as brokers or anything like that, but encouraging them to move in a particular direction. At the same time, the Kachin and the other, they've constituted particularly the leadership was taken by the Kachins, but they joined with the others and formed what is called the nationwide ceasefire coordination team of the ethnic armed groups, which is again a first in many ways, because I don't think the ethnic armed groups had actually moved together and in any composite kind of a manner to form one negotiating team. And I think the greatest achievement of the 3 years in which the NCCT was formed was to be able to see the emergence of a common ethnic armed group kind of a position, even despite all the different kind of variations they had. And I think that to some extent helped each of them to try and work out their own tolerances vis-a-vis each other. Now we are facing, in a very strange way, when things are coming to more detail, we are seeing some of the more powerful groups running away from that kind of a process, because they think that this will probably remain a lowest common factor kind of a position in terms of the armed groups. And now we are seeing, particularly after the permanent meetings, we are seeing a kind of a slightly different kind of a way, a position emerging. The hostilities in Kokang for February 2015 generated serious tension, and that I think caused some of the major ethnic groups who were part of the UNHC to step back from signing that. In some ways, it was the Kokang situation which created a kind of a major breach within the ethnic armed groups, and almost the 19 groups which were together in the NCCT working. Only 8 eventually signed the NCCT, even though even the Kachins had broadly accepted the text of the nationwide ceasefire. It was not as if they had any major problems with the text in terms of the ceasefire agreement. But the idea was, at the last minute, in March 2015, they had reached the agreement. In October, when the signing was to take place, some of the ethnic armed groups stepped back and said that there was no inclusivity. They talked about the Kokang, and this is in the context of the Kokang tensions, and what's called the United Nationalities Federal Council stepped back from signing them. Many of them stepped back from signing the nationwide ceasefire agreement. Now, in the event it was signed, the 8 groups that signed, including the Karens, signed, and it was widely welcomed as a milestone on the path of peace in Myanmar. The ceasefire agreement was ratified in Parliament in December of 2015, and a joint monitoring committee was established. In fact, the UN also provided a platform. The UN was part of this joint monitoring team, but more as a funding, not in terms of actual in actually doing the monitoring at the local level. The first session of after the nationwide ceasefire agreement was signed, they moved on, under the agreement itself, they moved on to the next stage of the political dialogue. And the first stage of the political dialogue took place on the 12th of January in 2016, even after the results of the elections were announced, but before the new government came into power. And it was, despite all the differences that Tausu had with regard to the way in which the previous government had moved the peace process, her presence at the January meeting and the fact that she was there and her statement gave it a blessing that there would be continuity in the follow-up. And while she has been moving forward to try and get the non-signatories to join the process, her position has not essentially changed from the position of the army. That is, the NCA, that which is already signed, would be the basis, and that others would have to join that rather than move through a separate ceasefire process or a separate negotiation process. And I think this major difference has actually remained even now. It has actually in some ways aggravated, but in the earlier stages, and WA has never been part of the process of the the VA had never been part of the NCCT process. They were not negotiators with the government in the earlier, because they said that they had a separate ceasefire, and they didn't see the need for a new ceasefire agreement. However, when you move to the second stage of the process, that is the political dialogue, they realized that if they were not present, they would not be present in any of the arrangements being made for a political, for the overall political framework that would any structural agreement that was made, a political agreement that was made, they would not be there. And it is, we are now at that stage where the VA and many of the others have not only begun to see that they need to be part of the process, but they want to be part of the process without being part of the nationwide ceasefire agreement. The government position is that if you want to be part of the political process, you should be part of the ceasefire agreement, even though it is a pro forma signing. This is now where the differences now remain. Meanwhile, there has been in many ways, a deterioration in the tension between the northern, particularly the northern groups, the Karen and the Kokang, and the TNLA, which has been now, which is a very small group, which is actually brought up virtually, which is a surrogate of the KIA, is now increasingly active in the areas which would probably be part of the pipeline and the gas move towards Yunnan, and at the same time which is also areas which are important in terms of the mineral wealth of the country, including particularly in the Shan areas. And with the growing tensions within the ethnic armed groups themselves, you are now finding that the distance between some of the groups, the signatories and non-signatories, has actually been increasing rather than decreasing. Now it's not so much those which are signatories and non-signatories, it's more a question of those which have substantial armies and those which have really no armed presence. We are now finding that it's the ones that have significant armed strength are the ones who are non-signatories, except for the Karens, of course. But even there, within the Karens, there is a difference, there's a difficulty too. But essentially now the problem is getting to the northern part in the border, relating to the border with China. And there, you are seeing increasingly the lead is being taken by VA and not by Kachin, because Kachin has traditionally been the leader in terms of the negotiations with the government. The VA has been basically keeping out. But over the past few months, increasingly, Tangshan is becoming the center of the informal consultations, and there is a possibility in fact, I think it's a few months ago in February, they had the Pangshan, the group of the the non-signatories met at Pangshan and put their own proposals for working towards a political dialogue without the signing on the NCA, and sought to push that. In an attempt to try and talk to them, Dao Su had sent her own negotiator, but they were not able to move forward very much. But I think in the process, the impression seemed to have gained, I think, among the government negotiators, that pressure could be brought to bear on them from China. And it was at this stage that Dao Su actually visited Beijing in the connection with the BRI, I think, and it is at that time that the Chinese. This is at a time when you see that this is the end of the year. The UN was no longer in the picture, and our links with the ethnic armed groups was more or less almost come to an end. there was no real connection between any outsiders with the certainly not with the UN. The Americans are in contact with the Kachins, but obviously not with the other groups. And progressively you find the KIA is increasingly now almost on its own. And they're not sure whether they would join. They have been in a situation where they were not sure whether they should join in with the signatories or move towards the more radical position, which is reflective of the community itself, and move towards the WA. And you are seeing increasingly that that's what they are actually doing in order to be able to. Now this will bring most of these non-signatory groups under the influence of China, and it's almost subject to a strong direction and guidance from China. At this time, Xi Jinping tells the lady that we will help you in your peace process. And then this Panglong conference is to take place within a few months in August, and is it in May? Yeah, just in May. In May. And at that time you find the situation where in fact the discussions, Sun Goshan accompanies, goes to both the army as well as the political, the government negotiators, gives an assurance that he will be able to get these people to join the second Panglong meeting, and in fact goes back to Yunnan, collects all of them, puts them in an aircraft and brings them to this. It's an amazing situation. All of them come, and you find that the presence, they are there as special invitees, and they are there for first few days, but the army remains adamant in its position that unless the substantive discussion, they will not be there unless they sign on the dotted line. The lady, on the other hand, meets with them, has discussions with them, and holds out possibilities of them being able to be part of the peace process. A unique kind of dynamic comes into play where the lady seems to be more working in a sense beyond the red lines which the army has given, and at the same time the message which these armed groups give inside the country when they come to meet with her and when they go back is again different. They talk, the discussions in Pangsang as well as in Myitkyina are very, very strong, and saying that unless some of these basic sort of the basic points which they have made are attended to, they are not going to be able to join the peace process. So you are seeing actually a situation where, despite the fact that the second conference, the Panglong conference, talks about having made agreements on 37 of the 41 issues and of the 12 political items that were under discussion, they were able to get agreement on many of them, including the concept of federalism and drawing up of constitution at the state and center level. These are very, very broad generalities, and clearly they've reached nowhere close to the actual discussion, except the problem which the Shan raised about the question of the inclusion of a prohibition of secession in the agreement itself. Here again, I think the point which Rajiv, you made, is possibly slightly different. It's not as if these ethnic armed groups wanted their right to secession being reflected. It is actually the contrary. It is their unwillingness to allow the army to insist that there will be no secession, there's no possibility of secession, considering the fact that the 48 Constitution did have a reference to secession. They wanted to rule it out completely. They said, don't put that as yet. Most of the armed groups have been saying that it's unrealistic to think of breaking away. We are thinking of redefining federalism. We are thinking in terms of moving forward. It's not that we are all calling for secession, but we are not going to accept this sort of straightforward, cutting out of any reference to secession. There will be no secession at this stage. And I think it is that stage at which you are now. So the army, by and large, I think, is
working on its own its own hard line, and they are not willing to move as yet towards discussion on the next stage of the peace process unless some of these things are discussed. And that, I think, will remain. This idea of how you move forward. My own sense is that even a non-reference to secession at this stage, that is negative, that there will be no secession, is not going to really make a big deal. They know the bottom line of the army. The main problems will be demobilization before you come to any kind of political process. And the question of what would be the status of the armies, how would the various armed forces be reflected in many ways. So these are the various problems which are going to come. And it looks now as if the Chinese have now with the ground left entirely to themselves with no UN in position. Unfortunately, whereas in the past, in the previous government of Thein, people like Wong Min were able to insist on the presence of the United Nations, I think that dynamic doesn't work now. Because for many reasons, there is no special advisor and there is no political presence of the United Nations in the country. And I don't think the current negotiators, including my good friend who's the minister in Dao Su's office, is the State Councillor's office, I don't think they are very much inclined to accept a UN presence. Whether it will become necessary for them at a later stage when the discussions take place, I'm not sure. My own sense is that as the next stages, the next few stages of the peace process, particularly the informals between the Northern Alliance and the government take place, I think they may find the need for an outside presence apart from that of China. Because the Chinese now it increasingly looks as if not even Chiang Mai is going to be the focus of the discussions, but Kunming is going to be the focus. And if that happens, it is going to, the transparency in terms of how the ethnic armed groups would like to work out their positions, their contacts with the United States and others will get increasingly depleted. There's those which are not the Southern Yunnan group, because there's the WA, the MDNA, and the Mongla, etc. are much closer. They are almost Chinese in that sense. They're part of the Southern China, Southern Yunnan state, in fact. So in that sense, there will be a difference. But my own sense is that as the substance of the peace process moves forward, they will feel the need for some outside presence. And the government, the armed groups will keep insisting, and the government may find eventually, they may find that returning to the Wu-Aoming position may perhaps be of more benefit to them than it is at present. In all this, what is the place of China? Obviously the place of China. And that the Chinese have over the years, obviously they've had a very, you've seen the 5-part Bertel Lindner's sort of study in the Irrawaddy. It's clear that over the years, the Chinese have had to come to a recognition that with democratization, that there will be a change in Myanmar, and that Myanmar will integrate itself with the international community. That was the stated purpose of, it was mentioned in Thein Sein's own, I think, the public statement too. Economically, as well as in terms of, even in terms of relations with the army, between the army and the West, many of them, though they were subjected to a lot of since the rule of the SLORC and its predecessor, the West has actually cut off all links, but they still have the Myanmar officers still have very fond memories of their links with in Fort Benning and things like that, and they do talk about that. But it's not so much that they have a very great chemistry, but it's a question of wanting to have options vis-a-vis China. I think there is a very strong sense that while they recognize the reality of the relationship with China, the dependence, and the fact that when almost consistently when they were with their backs to the wall, the Chinese have helped them. So there is a vestigial sense of loyalty to China too. But at the same time, there has always been a kind of a deep suspicion of communism, of the larger political interests of China, including in the army certainly, the problems relating to the BRI. And I think from that point of view, the many local communities have talked about the need for greater transparency in discussions and Tencent's own suspension of the Midsoon Dam itself is a reflection of that. The public demonstrations on the mine project in Nepatong is also another indication. So obviously there are a whole series of concerns that they have, but at the same time, I think seems to be my impression at the present moment is that the political leaders in Myanmar now seem to be a lot more confident, almost hubristic about how they can handle the problems. The army is a lot more reserved and a lot more suspicious about how this can be done. And it seems to be that the problems that the lady has been facing because of the public uproar outside over Rakhine and other things have actually got her in a sense, on the rebound. She seems to be getting worked up about that and refused, and therefore moving in this direction. It almost looks like that. And it almost looks as if she thinks she can manage it fully. On the other hand, I think the absence of any other solid partner, international partner, available to help the Myanmar government at this stage have actually left the place open for China, and they've been fairly active in trying to take up. Public diplomacy-wise also they've been very active. They've also been able to be very agile in terms of the response to when the Midsoon Dam problem is clearly going to affect the agreement which they have on the dam itself. But they're quickly able to turn the sort of the concerns, the emphasis, and move it to the direction now of the larger infrastructural sort of possibilities opening up, and some kind of vestigial sense of obligation which the Myanmar government may have, they're trying to leverage maximum. And I think that eventually this will see a far greater proactive approach, and that is evident even now in the way in which the embassy is functioning, the Chinese embassy is functioning in Myanmar. They are far more active, far more assertive, and that is having public consequences also. And I think the most important reaction is that the Chinese themselves realize the impact at all levels of what they are doing, and they are able to to adjust very well. And my own sense is that you will see a much greater degree of activity of the Chinese in Myanmar over the coming years, and how to respond to that. Let me come back with some very, very broad kind of generalizations just to conclude. The expectation that Aung San Suu Kyi will become a catalyst of democratic institution building has so far remained unfulfilled. She is, of course, she's 70 plus and she is probably fit for another term. But there is need to ensure a second-tier leadership, which is not seem to happen. This does not seem to be happening. As it stands, it is personal loyalty and access rather than professional competence that determines the allotment of power or decision-making. And decision-making is more a functioning of positioning rather than of process. There doesn't seem to be any major change in the process. Though the previous USDP government did show similar deficiencies, I think it was more prepared to deal with the opposition on issues. It was more prepared to look at institution building than the present one is. This is my personal view. The NLD's treatment of even opposition parties like the 88 generation and other ethnic parties like the Shan NLD has shown little confidence or trust. the trust between the lady and the army does not seem to have developed, even though there is no overt sniping, of course. Dawsu realizes that she cannot challenge the power base of the army at this stage. On her part, she will refrain from uncomfortable or unpopular action using the control exercised by the army as a foil. Effectively, I think she has managed, and many public comments talk about why the army will not allow her to do these things. I don't think the army is really avoiding. In fact, they are trying to. It's interesting that even in this, with regard to Rakhine, for the first time, perhaps ever, at least for the last several years, there's a public demonstration in Yangon supporting the army just a few weeks ago. I mean, this would have been unthinkable even 4 years ago. But you have that happening. So there is a certain, partly as a result of the Rakhine incidents and the problems that they've been facing since October particularly. But I think there is a kind of, even among the people as a whole, there is a sense that some of the positions that the army has been taking, favoring the majoritarian position, are popular. And that's, I think, meanwhile, the Tatmadaw does not have a time frame. They can afford to wait. Even the ethnic armed groups can afford to wait. She has a time frame. So I think she's going to press a little more. The outside world had hoped that Dawsu would take firm and effective action to assert her moral authority. I still think that on Rakhine, she's the only one who can actually assert her moral authority. It is having a problem, it is having some, there is some difficulty because even the latest action taken on the Mabatha is actually not being so popular, and it is actually helping to, within some groups, it is actually enhancing their popularity. It's a very strange situation, and you can understand the kind of problems she is facing in reacting to both international pressure on the one hand and pressures within the country on the other. The Annan Commission, I think, is still, I think, a possibility of finding a way out in terms of the communal problem in Rakhine. In regard to the peace process, I think neither she nor her main advisors have shown any indication of trying to build chemistry or reaching out to the ethnic armed groups. They seem to want them to come over, and there is a strange bureaucratic kind of a position which is happening. The person who is really her main contact, Dr. Tinyovin, he is a very good man, he's very well liked, but he's seen as not being able to take very many decisions, and he doesn't seem to have inspired confidence with the ethnic armed groups. And I think in seeking the active mediatory efforts of China, especially with the Northern Alliance, I think Dawsu risks evoking the suspicions of the Tatmadaw. And I think eventually there will be doubts about hidden deals on both sides. And I think there will eventually therefore be the need for an external balancing factor also. I feel that the UN can be that balancing factor. I don't know I don't think any other neighbor is really going to offer itself or even be a possible balancing factor. But I think from India's point of view, it will be useful for India to work discreetly with the Tatmadaw to help the peace process, without obviously getting into any competition with any other country, without questioning any motivations relating to either the OBOR or Myanmar's response to it. I think we could engage with infrastructure projects, as Patricia has said, and discuss them transparently, and in some ways meet with the requirements of good neighborliness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that